An old pickup climbed the autumn mountain road as a former Navy SEAL drove toward his dead friend's home. Before he could reach the porch, a German shepherd rushed over and pressed his nose against the bag. Then the dog pulled hard toward the leaf-covered road, stopping only to look back at him. "My son came home in a coffin," the grieving father said. "You came home alive." The mother stared at the dog and whispered, "Before he left, he taught him to." Then could not finish. He had planned to leave before sunrise, but now the German shepherd was waiting in the road. Stay with this story until the end, and like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journeys of loyalty and healing. By the time Mason Hale saw the first hand-painted sign for Redfern Hollow, the afternoon light had gone the color of old brass. The road narrowed between wooded slopes, where maples burned red and copper above low stone walls. Fallen leaves skittered over the hood of his pickup whenever the wind came down the mountain. Mason drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders loose, only because he had spent years teaching them to look that way. At 36, he had been out of the Navy barely 6 weeks. His dark hair had grown longer than regulation, and stubble shadowed an angular, sun-browned face. He wore a dark moss t-shirt beneath a charcoal olive field jacket, blue-gray cargo pants, brown boots, and a black watch. In the passenger footwell sat an olive canvas bag. Mason had moved it there because keeping it on the seat made him look at it every few minutes. Moving it had not helped. The Warren family had already received Eli's official effects months ago. This bag was different. Eli Warren, Mason's closest friend and teammate, had left it in a shared personal storage space before their last deployment, along with a careless note telling Mason not to let anyone throw it out. The bag held things too ordinary for an inventory clerk, and too personal for Mason to touch. He had known where Redfern Hollow was for 8 months. He had simply found reasons not to come. The village appeared gradually. A barn, weathered houses between apple trees, a white church, then a small general store beside the post office. Redfern Hollow held only a little more than 100 people, scattered enough that village felt more like an agreement than a shape. Eli had talked about it on long nights, when everyone started naming the food and places they missed. Apple butter in October, his father's terrible coffee, his mother's habit of feeding anyone who crossed the porch after 6, a German shepherd that stole work gloves, but only the left one. Now, passing faces that stayed on his truck too long, Mason understood he had only known Eli's version. 8 months earlier, Eli had died while coming back to support the team's withdrawal. Mason and the others had made it out. The official wording had been careful. Redfern Hollow had supplied the rest. Eli went back. Mason came home. Mason did not attend the funeral, did not call Samuel or June, did not write. Silence gave people room to build whatever explanation fit the grief. Here, the story had hardened into something simple. Eli Warren went back for Mason Hale, and Mason left him there. Mason knew what people believed. He had never corrected them. Some part of him believed correction would be another way of asking to be spared. The Warren house sat near the upper edge of the village, where patched asphalt became gravel. Mason recognized it from a photograph. Weathered cedar siding, a deep porch, a stone chimney, and a maple broad enough to shade most of the yard. He nearly drove past. His foot eased off the brake as if his body had made a decision without him. Another mile, he thought. Turn around somewhere private. Come back tomorrow. Maybe leave the bag with a name on it. The thought lasted a second. Mason pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. Cooling metal ticked under the hood as wind moved leaves across the yard. Then a faint metallic slide came from beneath the maple. A German shepherd stood there. The dog was large, black and tan, with a dark mask, an uneven saddle dipping lower over the left hip, and an old oval brass tag on a brown leather collar. his right ear angled slightly outward. A running line gave him most of the yard. Mason's first reaction was quick anger. Then he saw the full water bowl, a blanket airing over the porch rail, and the worn dog door near the steps. This was not neglect. The dog was healthy, brushed, alert. Mason opened the truck slowly. The shepherd did not bark. "You'd know Bracken," Eli had once said. "Ugly right ear. Thinks he's management." Mason had laughed then. Now he stepped onto the gravel and said the name quietly. "Bracken." The dog's head lifted. Amber brown eyes fixed on him. Bracken came forward without running, smelled Mason's sleeve, hand, jacket, then touched his nose once to Mason's knuckles. The contact lasted less than a second. Eli had touched this dog, walked this yard, complained about black and tan hair on every shirt he owned. Mason looked toward the porch because grief was easier when it did not have eyes. Bracken moved past his hand and sniffed toward the truck. The olive bag was visible in the passenger footwell. Mason watched the dog's nose lift. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's his." He reached inside and brought the bag out. Bracken changed at once. His ears came forward. He pressed his nose to one corner of the canvas and inhaled slowly. Then again. Mason expected whining or pawing. Bracken did neither. He stepped away, turned sharply toward the narrow road climbing beyond the property, and walked until the running line reached its end. The brass tag clicked once. Bracken stopped facing uphill, then looked back at Mason, at the bag, and up the road again. It was the first thing since Mason entered Redfern Hollow that did not fit the story he had prepared himself to endure. A porch board creaked. "What are you doing here?" Mason turned. Samuel Warren stood in the doorway, broad even at 68. His left knee held a little stiff as he came onto the porch. White gray hair, a thick gray mustache, faded denim work shirt, brown canvas jacket. Eli had Samuel's eyes. Mason had not expected that detail to hurt. Behind him stood June Warren, 65, silver blonde hair gathered in a loose low knot, burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse. One hand rose to her mouth when she saw Mason. For one terrible beat, her face changed, as if recognition had outrun reason. Then she saw Mason clearly, and hope corrected itself. Samuel asked again, "What are you doing here?" Mason lowered the bag. "I brought Eli's things." June stepped forward, eyes dropping to the canvas, then stopped. Samuel said, "The Navy already sent his things. These weren't with the official effects. He left them in our personal storage before the last deployment." Samuel repeated one word. "Our." Mason nodded. June asked, "Did you open it?" "No, ma'am." Samuel gave a short breath. "Set it on the bench." Mason placed the bag against the porch wall. June moved as if she might reach for the zipper, but folded her hands instead. Samuel looked at Mason for a long moment. "My son came home in a coffin." The wind pushed a scatter of maple leaves across the yard. Samuel's voice stayed level. "You drove." Mason had rehearsed answers across nearly 2,000 miles. None survived the porch. He could have said the story was incomplete, that he had gone back, that Eli had made his own choice. Instead, he said, "I know." June closed her eyes. Samuel's jaw tightened. "That's it?" Mason looked at the porch boards. "I don't expect anything from you." "Good." June said her husband's name softly, but Samuel did not look away. He had 8 months. That was the part Mason could not argue with. 8 months was enough time to call, write, or show up. He had done none of it. June asked, "Why now?" "Because I finally ran out of reasons not to," he thought. Aloud, he said, "It was time." Samuel glanced toward the pickup. "You staying?" "No." Too fast. Both of them heard it. "Good," Samuel said. Bracken's brass tag clicked against the lower step. June looked down. "Come inside, Bracken." The dog did not move. He looked toward Mason, then toward the uphill road. Samuel frowned. "Not this again." Mason caught the phrase, but the door was already opening. June lingered as if she might explain, then looked at the canvas bag with something close to fear, and followed Samuel inside. The door shut. Mason stood on the porch with Bracken below him. A truck slowed on the road a few minutes later. The driver stared openly. Another passed before dusk. Redfern Hollow might cover several miles, but news moved through it like one kitchen. Near sunset, he drove to the general store for fuel, coffee, and something to eat. Conversations thinned when he entered. The woman at the register had curly gray-brown hair, tortoiseshell glasses, and a name tag that read, Marin. She looked at his sandwich and paper cup. "You passing through?" Something like that. "Road ends eventually." "Most do." One corner of her mouth moved. That sounded expensive. A man near the back shelves said, "Some people know all about leaving." Mason looked toward him, then turned back to the register before anger found a use. Marin bagged his things. "Coffee's bad after 5. I've had worse." "I believe you." Mason preferred the absence of pity. He paid and left. By full dark, he was back at the Warren property, parked along the far edge of the drive. The olive bag remained on the porch. By 9, Bracken was inside, and the downstairs lights were out. Mason reclined the driver's seat and pulled his jacket closed against the cold. He told himself he would leave before dawn. Delivering the bag had been the only reason to come, yet sleep did not arrive. Close to midnight, a scratching sound brought him upright. It came from the house. A downstairs light turned on. The front door opened, and Bracken slipped past Samuel into the yard. The dog crossed the porch and trotted directly toward Mason's pickup. Mason opened the driver's door without thinking. Bracken stopped beside him and sat. "What's wrong?" The shepherd looked uphill, stood, and walked about 10 yards into the road. He stopped where the porch light began to weaken, turned, and looked back. Mason stayed beside the truck. Bracken returned, passed him, and repeated the same path. Samuel stood on the porch in a thermal shirt and work pants. "He'll do that until you stop watching or freeze." Mason glanced at him. "Do what?" "That." Bracken came back for the second time. June appeared behind Samuel, wrapping her cardigan around herself. Mason asked, "How long?" Samuel's face closed. June answered anyway. 3 months, maybe a little more." "Same direction?" "Mostly." Samuel folded his arms. "First time I found him a couple miles up. Second time Amos brought him back. Third time he was gone half a day." Mason looked toward the running line under the maple. Samuel followed his gaze. "That's why. Daytime only. He sleeps inside." "I saw." The answer seemed to take a small amount of heat out of Samuel's posture. June watched Bracken reach the same point in the road and stop. After Eli died, he stayed close, slept outside his room, waited by the door around supper. But he didn't run off. Then near the end of summer, everyone started getting ready for cold weather. Canning, stacking wood, orchard cleanup, generator checks. Her voice slowed. "That's when Bracken started this." Mason remembered Eli laughing about his father refusing help with a gutter while Bracken stole work gloves, and another story about checking on people before the first hard weather. He had filed those stories under home, not as a pattern. June said, "Eli used to make rounds every fall, little things. He'd see what needed doing before winter. Bracken always went." Mason looked uphill again. The dog was not necessarily searching for a dead man. Maybe autumn itself had brought back an old routine. Cooler nights, wood smoke, apples, familiar sounds, familiar stops. Bracken returned and stood beside Mason's knee. For the first time that night, Mason did not see a grieving animal. He saw a question. June watched them both. Before Eli left the last time, he taught that dog a June. Samuel did not raise his voice. He did not have to. June stopped. Mason looked from her to Samuel. Taught him what? June pulled the cardigan closer. Samuel said, "It's late." Bracken had already walked back to the dark edge of the road. Right ear angled outward, body still, waiting. Mason looked at his pickup. Duffel behind the seat, a clear road out. He had planned to leave something behind and disappear. Then Bracken returned, stopped directly in front of him, and looked up. Mason had spent 8 months avoiding every road toward Eli's family. Bracken had spent 3 months trying to walk one road over and over. Mason reached into the cab and pulled out his duffel. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "Changing the plan." "I didn't invite you in." "I know." "Then where are you staying?" Mason nodded toward the truck. "Right there." June looked from him to Bracken. Samuel said nothing. Mason closed the door. "At daylight, I'd like to see where he goes." "No," Samuel said. Mason nodded. "All right." That irritated Samuel more. "You always this agreeable." "No." June's mouth almost curved before she caught herself. Bracken turned uphill again. Mason watched him reach the edge of the porch light and stop. Samuel followed his gaze. No one spoke. Mason had intended to be gone before sunrise. Instead, for the first time since he entered Redfern Hollow, he made a choice that did not belong to the man who had driven in carrying a bag and a sentence against himself. He would still sleep in the truck. Samuel still did not want him there. June still could not touch Eli's things. None of that had changed. But Mason would be there when morning came. He did not know what Bracken was trying to repeat, or why June had stopped mid-sentence. He only knew the dog remembered something about Autumn that the rest of them had forgotten. Mason woke before daylight, because habit was easier to keep than sleep. The truck windows had fogged at the edges, and cold had worked through the seams of his jacket sometime after 3. For a few seconds, he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the Warren house beyond the windshield, the maple standing dark over the yard, and Bracken sitting inside the kitchen window, as if the dog had been waiting for Mason to wake first. The olive canvas bag was still on the porch bench. No one had moved it. Mason straightened slowly, rubbed both hands over his face, and checked the time on his black watch. 6:14. He had told himself he would stay until morning. Morning had arrived, and with it the part he had not planned. The front door opened before he could decide whether to get out. Samuel stepped onto the porch, wearing a faded denim shirt beneath a brown canvas jacket, one hand holding a mug. He looked toward Mason, then toward Bracken, who had already disappeared from the window. "You can leave whenever you like," Samuel called. Mason opened the truck door. "Good morning to you too." Samuel took a drink. Wasn't meant to be rude. That's encouraging. For the first time, something almost like irritation rather than hatred crossed Samuel's face. It was a small improvement. Mason accepted it. June appeared a minute later with Bracken on a leash. She wore the same burgundy cardigan over a sage-gray knit top, silver blonde hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. Bracken moved differently the moment his paws touched the porch, not excited. Focused. He looked toward the uphill road exactly as he had during the night. Mason watched the dog's ears. The left stood straight, the right angled outward. "I want to see where he goes," Mason said. Samuel answered before June could. "No." "Fair enough." Mason reached back into the truck for his water bottle. Samuel frowned. "That's all?" "You said no. You drove 2,000 miles and slept in a truck, but now you're taking directions?" Mason looked at him. Trying something new. June lowered her eyes, but he saw the beginning of a smile. Then she unclipped Bracken from the short house leash and attached a longer one hanging from a hook beside the door. Samuel stared at her. June. He's going to try again whether Mason is here or not. That doesn't mean we hand him over. Then come with them. Samuel looked as though several arguments arrived at once, and none pleased him. Bracken solved it by stepping off the porch and pulling gently toward the road. June handed the leash to Mason. Don't let him drag you. Mason took it. I've worked with worse partners. Samuel came down the steps with his mug. Eli said the same thing about you. That was the first time Samuel had used Eli's name in Mason's presence without turning it into a weapon. The words landed strangely. Mason did not answer. Bracken was already moving. He did not run or weave through the roadside leaves. He followed the right edge of the lane at a steady working walk, slowing at driveways and speeding slightly where the road opened. Mason gave the leash enough slack to see what the dog chose. Samuel followed 10 feet behind. Morning climbed slowly over Redfern Hollow, touching the roofs before it reached the valley floor. Wood smoke hung between houses. Somewhere, a truck started with 3 stubborn turns of the engine. Apples lay bruised beneath trees along the road, sweetening the cold air. Bracken passed the first 2 houses without hesitation. At the third bend, he turned down a narrow gravel drive bordered by split-rail fencing. Mason stopped. This one? Samuel nodded once. Dorothy Ames. Bracken walked straight past the front steps and around the side of a small white house. An elderly woman in a quilted vest opened the kitchen door before they reached the back. She was 78, narrow in the shoulders, with short white hair and a face that seemed permanently prepared to laugh at trouble. She looked at Bracken, then at Samuel, then Mason. Well, she said, it's that time again. Mason glanced at Samuel. Dorothy pointed toward a woodshed against the back fence. Bracken went to it and sat. The near stack was lower than the others, with several oversized rounds sitting beside the chopping block. Eli used to come by around now, Dorothy said. Not because I'm helpless, so don't start making that face, Samuel. Samuel had not spoken. I wasn't. You were preparing to. She looked at Mason. You must be Mason Hale. It was not a question. He nodded. Dorothy studied him with no attempt to hide it. But her gaze lacked the hard edge he had seen elsewhere. You're younger than people make you sound. That happens. They talk like you arrived on a horseback in 1863. Samuel gave a reluctant cough that might have covered a laugh. Dorothy opened the shed. My delivery man's late. Eli never supplied all my wood. He just had a personal grudge against anything too heavy for me to split. Bracken lay beside the chopping block, as if waiting for the next part of an old routine. Mason understood before anyone asked. He took off his field jacket, set it over the fence, and picked up the maul. Samuel watched. You don't have to. Mason set the first round upright. Neither did Eli. The answer silenced both men. He split enough wood to fill the small rack near Dorothy's kitchen door. Not an hour's performance, 10 minutes of work. When he finished, Dorothy handed him a glass of water and gave Bracken half a plain biscuit from a jar. He used to get one after Eli stacked the last piece, she said. Bracken took it carefully. Mason looked at the dog. The first question had an answer now. Bracken remembered a stop, but a single stop could be coincidence. When they returned to the road, Bracken did not turn home. He led them downhill toward the white church Mason had passed the day before. Its parking lot held 2 pickups and a stack of folded tables left over from some community supper. Bracken crossed to a side door near a squat metal enclosure. An older man was already there, kneeling with a toolbox. Mason recognized the name before Samuel spoke it. Amos Bell. Amos stood with one hand against his knee. At 74, he was lean, slightly stooped, with thin white hair and wire-frame glasses. An old analog radio rode on his belt. "Well, look who remembered the schedule," he said to Bracken. Then he noticed Mason. "And look who the schedule brought with him." Mason expected another accusation. Amos only held out a hand. "Amos." Mason shook it. "Mason?" "I know." Amos turned back to the metal housing. "Eli and I ran the generator every fall before the first real cold. Church owns it. Volunteer fire keeps a key. Everybody thinks somebody else checks the battery." He tapped the enclosure. "That's how machinery develops religion." Bracken sat where a patch of grass had been worn bare beside the wall. Mason crouched at the battery compartment with Amos. He knew enough electrical systems to be useful, but he let Amos lead. The main unit started after a rough cough. The backup battery tested weak. "Not dead," Mason said. "Not good either." Amos nodded. "Needs replacing before we need it instead of while we're discussing it." Samuel stood near the church steps, arms folded. Mason could feel him watching, not the machine, but Mason's hands. Bracken moved as soon as the enclosure was closed. No command, no coaxing. He simply stood and headed toward the road. Mason followed. That mattered more than he wanted it to. The dog was not searching for random problems. Bracken was repeating places where Eli had routinely stopped, and at each one, there happened to be a small piece of preparation that had not been fully picked up by someone else. Not disaster, not destiny. Just absence made visible through ordinary things. A low wood rack, a weak battery. Mason knew Eli as the man who could turn a terrible meal into an argument worth having, and who sang badly enough to make threats of violence understandable. He had not known Eli checked a widow's woodpile or a church generator when he came home. The realization created an ache different from the one Mason carried from the last mission. This was not guilt. It was the quieter pain of discovering there had been rooms in his friend's life he had never entered. The third stop was farther down, where the village road split around an old school building and a row of modest houses. Bracken turned up a porch ramp and sat by the screen door. A thin man in his 70s opened it before Mason knocked. His hands trembled slightly, even while resting against the frame. "You're late," he told Bracken. The dog's tail gave one slow sweep. "Don't encourage him, Lester," Samuel said. Lester Boone, 76, looked at Mason. "You must be the famous one." Mason had learned not to ask famous for what. Lester saved him the trouble. "Everyone has a version. I stopped collecting them around breakfast." He disappeared inside and returned with a biscuit. Bracken took it and sat. "Eli used to stop here if weather was coming," Lester explained. "My prescriptions come up from town every other week. Delivery service is usually fine. When roads got bad, Eli would pick them up if he was already going down." He tapped his fingers against the porch rail. "I have enough for now. Tessa put me on her winter list last year." Mason looked at Samuel. "Tessa?" "Volunteer fire chief. Emergency coordinator when the mountain decides to be difficult." Lester pointed at Bracken. "Dog doesn't know medicine from motor oil. He remembers the biscuit." Mason almost smiled. "That makes two of us." Lester laughed once. Samuel did not, but the line around his mouth eased. By late morning, Bracken had answered the question that kept Mason in Redfern Hollow. He was not wandering in confusion. He was replaying a seasonal route built from years of repetition with Eli. That answer should have been enough. Mason could have walked the dog home, collected his duffel, and left. Instead, Bracken kept moving, and the route kept widening Mason's view of a village that had existed only as stories before. They passed the small fire station with its red bay doors, the old school where one wing had been closed, the sawmill beyond the apple fields, and houses tucked up slopes where porches faced the morning sun. People recognized Bracken first. A woman sweeping leaves called his name. Two men at a garage stopped talking when they saw Mason holding the leash. An orchard worker lifted a hand to Samuel and let it fall when Mason looked over. Eli's presence seemed to be everywhere Mason went, but it changed depending on who spoke of him. Son, friend, neighbor, the man who knew how to get an old generator running, the one who checked on people without making them feel checked on. Mason had spent 8 months believing the worst thing about Eli's death was that it had ended one life. Walking through Redfern Hollow, he began to see the smaller absences left behind. The things a person had done so regularly that nobody noticed the shape of them until they stopped happening. Near noon, they reached Marin Shaw's general store. Samuel went inside for coffee. Mason stayed outside with Bracken until Marin opened the door and looked at him over her tortoiseshell glasses. "Heel out on the porch. You two, under supervision." Mason followed the dog in. Bracken settled near the counter as if he had done it dozens of times. A few men sat by the front window around a small table that looked designed for gossip and bad posture. One of them looked at Bracken. Eli always made his rounds before winter. His eyes moved to Mason. Man never could leave something undone when people needed him. Mason heard the second sentence inside the first. Samuel stiffened near the coffee urn. Mason said nothing. Marin set a cardboard box on the counter harder than necessary. "If everyone plans to hold court, buy something. Heat costs money, and none of you are attractive enough to qualify as entertainment." One man muttered into his cup. Another found sudden interest in a rack of canned beans. Mason looked at Marin. "Does that work often?" "No, but it improves my mood." For half a second, the room became only a room. Then Bracken stood and pulled lightly at the leash. Samuel checked his watch. He usually turns back after here. But Bracken walked past the road toward the Warren house. Mason slowed. Usually? What I remember from Eli's fall rounds. Bracken crossed an intersection and took a narrower road running toward the wooded side of the hollow. Samuel stopped. "No." Mason looked back. "No what?" "Eli didn't go this way for the regular checks." Bracken continued until the leash tightened, then turned toward Mason. Mason did not pull him forward. "Could be another place he remembers." Samuel's expression hardened. "Or the dog smells a squirrel." "Possible." That answer seemed to irritate Samuel, because Mason was not trying to turn the dog into something mystical. They followed. The road narrowed. Houses thinned. Through bare stretches of maple, Mason saw the land fall away into a rocky creek bed below. The sound reached him first. Tires humming over timber and steel. Harrow Bridge crossed a deep cut where the creek widened after heavy rain. It was not ancient, but old enough to have been repaired in different materials over different decades. Timber deck, steel rails, concrete and timber work at the approaches. A faded weight notice stood near one end. Bracken slowed as soon as the bridge came into view. Mason shortened the leash slightly. The dog approached the north end, stepped onto the first few boards, and stopped. He did not crouch in fear. His tail stayed low but steady. Ears shifted forward, then downward. Mason waited. "Come on, Bracken." The dog looked back at him but did not move. Samuel came alongside. "He afraid of bridges?" "Not that I know of." A truck engine approached from the far side. A light logging truck appeared beyond the trees and rolled toward them. Mason stepped well off the roadway with Bracken. The dog backed farther than necessary, body lowering as the truck reached the middle span. The bridge gave its expected wooden rumble under the tires. Then, near the north approach, a second sound came from below. A dull, heavy knock. Not loud, not dramatic. Mason felt it more through his boots than heard it. The truck continued on. Its driver lifted 2 fingers from the wheel and disappeared around the bend. Bracken stayed fixed on the bridge. Mason walked to the edge of the approach without stepping into traffic. Samuel followed more slowly. "You hear that?" Mason asked. "I heard something." "Does it always do that?" "Old bridge makes a dozen noises." "That wasn't what I asked." Samuel glanced at him, then down toward the slope beside the abutment. Mason did not pretend expertise he did not have. He had inspected structures for access and safety in another life, but that did not make him a bridge engineer. He walked the accessible ground beside the north approach, staying above the creek bank. Fallen leaves hid much of the soil. Where runoff had cut through, the earth around one side of the approach looked washed away more than the surrounding ground. A timber-bearing block visible below the deck sat slightly out of line with the others. Mason crouched, studying it from a distance. "Could be old." Samuel nodded. "Could be." "Could be nothing." "Yes." Bracken stood above them, nose angled toward the structure, listening. Mason climbed back to the road. He expected Samuel to dismiss it. Instead, the older man remained still, looking at the north end of the bridge, with a face Mason could not read. "What?" Mason asked. Samuel rubbed one thumb along the side of his mug, though it had been empty for miles. "Eli argued about this bridge before he left." The words changed the air between them. Mason looked at Bracken, then back at Samuel. "About what?" "I don't know all of it." "Who with?" Samuel waited long enough that Mason understood the answer mattered. Farther down the road, the logging truck's engine faded into the hills. Samuel watched the empty lane. "Ben Kersey." Mason had never heard the name. "Who's Ben Kersey?" "Runs transport for the timber outfit. Sits on the community council. Knows every family that needs a paycheck and reminds people when they forget." There was neither affection nor hatred in Samuel's tone, only history. Mason looked toward the bridge again. The morning had begun with a simple question. Where did Bracken go every autumn? The answer had led from woodpiles to batteries to medicine, all small places where Eli had once made himself useful. But Harrow Bridge did not feel like another ordinary stop. Mason asked, "What were they arguing about?" Samuel looked at him. "You want to know? Ask Ben." Mason nodded. "All right." Samuel gave a humorless breath. "You might want to enjoy how agreeable you're being while it lasts." Bracken stepped away from the bridge at last and came to stand between them. Mason looked down at the dog. The local goal had been simple: follow Bracken long enough to understand whether his midnight behavior meant anything. Now Mason knew. The dog remembered Eli's autumn route, and that route had already shown them real things Eli once helped watch over. But Bracken had also taken them somewhere Samuel did not expect. Somewhere Eli had argued about before leaving Redfern Hollow. Mason had planned to stay one morning. That plan was gone. Samuel started back toward home, then stopped after several steps. "Ben usually checks the yard early." Mason looked up. Samuel did not turn around. "And he's going to hate that you're asking questions about his bridge." Mason glanced once more at Harrow Bridge. Bracken's right ear tipped outward as another faint vibration moved through the deck. It was no longer only a road Eli had walked. Now Mason wanted to know what his friend had noticed before he left, and why Bracken still refused to cross. Ben Kersey arrived at Harrow Bridge before 8 the next morning, in a brown work truck, with mud dried along the wheel wells and a clipboard wedged against the windshield. Mason was already there with Samuel and Bracken, though Mason had made a point of standing off the roadway and touching nothing. Samuel had called Ben shortly after dawn, not because he suddenly trusted Mason, but because the dull knock beneath the bridge had bothered him enough to keep him awake. Ben stepped out wearing a burnt brown canvas jacket over a dark green flannel, tan work pants, steel-toe boots, and the expression of a man who had begun arguing before he shut the truck door. At 57, he was broad through the chest and heavy in the shoulders, with iron gray hair, a close salt and pepper beard, and a carpenter's pencil tucked into his shirt pocket. He looked first at Samuel, then at the bridge, and only then at Mason. "This him?" he asked. Samuel nodded. Ben's eyes settled on Mason. "Heard you found a bad bridge yesterday." Mason glanced at the structure. "I found an old bridge that made a sound I didn't understand." "That's less impressive." "Wasn't trying to impress you." Ben gave him a brief, measuring look. Bracken sat beside Samuel, his brown leather collar catching the cold morning light. The dog's right ear angled outward toward the bridge whenever a vehicle moved on the far road. Ben walked the north approach and crouched near the section Mason had noticed. He did not dismiss the erosion. That made Mason take him more seriously. "We've had washout here before," Ben said. "County patched the shoulder 3 years ago. Timber block underneath has been sitting crooked since at least spring." "You sure?" Mason asked. "I drive this bridge more than you've driven into town." "That wasn't my question." Ben straightened. "You always talk like that?" "Apparently." Samuel stared toward the creek as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. Ben pointed toward the mill road. "Almost 20 households in this hollow depend on logging, trucking, fuel, or equipment work. We shut this bridge in late October. People don't lose an afternoon. They lose weeks." Mason nodded. "Then don't shut it because I say so." Ben looked surprised. Mason continued. "I don't know if it's unsafe. I'm not a bridge engineer." "Good. We agree on something. I think somebody who is qualified should look at it before heavy loads keep crossing." Ben's mouth tightened. "And while we wait for the county to remember we exist? That part's not mine to decide." A dark green utility SUV rolled up before Ben could answer. The driver parked well clear of the bridge and got out carrying a radio and a yellow notebook. Tessa Boone, 52, Redfern Hollow's volunteer fire chief and emergency coordinator, had the square, steady build of someone accustomed to moving equipment without asking whether anyone thought she should. Her ash-brown hair, streaked with silver, was cut short at the nape. A forest green weather shell covered a navy work shirt, and a radio microphone sat high on her left shoulder. Mason had seen her name on a volunteer notice at the fire station, but had not met her. She greeted Samuel first. "Morning." Then Ben. "You look cheerful." "I was until everybody developed an opinion about my bridge." "It's not your bridge." "That's never stopped anybody from blaming me for it." Tessa looked at Mason. "Hail! Mason!" "Tessa." No question about the Navy. No pause over Eli. She opened the notebook. "Show me what you heard and what you saw." That was all Mason wanted. They waited for a light delivery truck to cross while everyone stood off the approach. The normal rattle came first. Near the north end, the same dull knock sounded underneath. Bracken backed 2 steps and lowered his body slightly, ears tracking downward. Tessa noticed both the sound and the dog, but did not assign meaning to either. "Again," she said. Ben frowned. "You want me to order another truck for the experiment?" "No. I'd like to avoid turning public infrastructure into entertainment." She walked the accessible shoulder with Ben and Samuel, then inspected the washout from above. Mason stayed close enough to answer questions, but did not tell her what to think. Tessa asked when Samuel last remembered the timber block being aligned differently. Samuel could not say. She asked Ben about typical truck weights, recent rain, repairs, and how many heavy loads were scheduled before the end of the week. Ben answered all of it without evasion. That mattered too. He was not hiding a collapsing bridge. He was trying to protect a livelihood that ran over it. After 20 minutes, Tessa closed the notebook. "I'm not closing Harrow." Ben exhaled. Mason said nothing. "But she continued. "Until somebody from the county can look at that north support and the erosion, I want the heavier loads spaced out. No 2 loaded trucks on the span together, no queuing on the north approach. And I want drivers slow enough that we're not adding unnecessary shock." Ben rubbed a hand across his beard. "That's going to back up the yard." "Then back it up. Tessa, you wanted me here because I'm allowed to make temporary safety calls when access could affect emergency response. This is the temporary call." Ben looked at Mason. "Congratulations," Mason answered. "Wasn't my decision. You started it. The bridge started it." Tessa's mouth moved at one corner. "I can see why people enjoy both of you so much." Samuel looked away, but Mason caught the smallest shift in his face. By noon, the whole hollow seemed to know. At the general store, 2 mill workers argued quietly near the cooler. One said slowing the trucks was sensible. The other said sensible did not pay propane bills. Mason did not blame either man. He had spent enough years around plans drawn from a distance to know that temporary could sound different to someone who counted wages by the day. The harder part was hearing his own name attached to it. Hale came in and told Tessa the bridge was bad. Former SEAL thinks every loose board is a mission. Samuel Warren ought to know better than to bring that man around Eli's work. None of it was completely accurate. None of it had to be. Mason bought fuel, bread, and dog biscuits June had asked for without looking at the people talking. Marin Shaw rang him up and said, "If you keep ruining everybody's morning, I may have to charge an entertainment tax. Put it on Ben. He already owes me for 2 coffees and an opinion." Mason took the paper bag. "Does he know?" "About the coffee, yes. About the opinion, he thinks those are free." The restriction held through the afternoon. Nothing dramatic happened. No beam cracked. No truck swayed. That should have lowered the tension. Instead, it sharpened the question. If the bridge had always made that sound, why had Bracken refused it? If Eli had argued about Harrow before leaving, what had he actually noticed? Mason did not get an answer that day. He got one phone call the next morning. His phone vibrated against the truck console just after 7. Samuel's name was not saved, but Mason recognized the number from the evening before. "Yeah?" A pause. Then Samuel said, "Dog's gone." Mason was awake before the sentence ended. "How?" "Side gate. I didn't set the lower latch." "Which direction?" "You know which direction." Mason was out of the truck and pulling on his boots. Samuel added, "I'm not asking you because I trust you." "Would have been a strange morning if you did." Another pause. "Meet me at the bridge." Samuel ended the call. That was the first time he had called Mason for help. Mason did not let himself make more of it than Samuel had intended. They found Bracken beneath the north end of Harrow Bridge, not on the roadway. The German Shepherd lay in dry leaves beside an old timber support where the slope flattened above the creek. His leash was gone because he had left the Warren yard without one, but he had not wandered far once he reached the bridge. Samuel called him sharply. Bracken lifted his head but stayed where he was. Mason descended the safer portion of the bank, with Samuel several steps behind. "Bracken?" The dog stood and moved aside. A strip of faded red fabric had been tied around one horizontal timber, nearly gray with weather, except where the knot protected the color. Samuel stopped. Mason looked at him. "You know it?" Samuel stepped closer, but did not touch the fabric. Eli used to carry pieces of old survey ribbon and cloth in his truck. If he saw something he wanted to come back to, he'd tie one up. His jaw moved. Drove me crazy. Never wrote anything down where a normal person could find it. Technical system. He called it remembering. The knot looked old. Months, maybe longer. Mason did not guess. He moved his attention uphill instead. A shallow drainage channel crossed the slope above the northern abutment. Recent leaves had collected in it, but the cut itself showed years of water movement. Where runoff curved toward the bridge approach, the soil was scoured deeper than Mason had noticed from the road. He crouched on firm ground and studied the exposed roots and washed gravel. "This could explain the erosion," he said. Samuel looked down from above. "Could. Still doesn't tell us how much it matters." "No." Bracken stood near the red marker, listening to the bridge overhead. Samuel rubbed both hands together against the cold. Eli didn't tie things for decoration. Mason looked at him. "You want Tessa?" Samuel hesitated only a moment. "Yes." That answer was another state change neither man named. Tessa returned with Ben an hour later. This time, Ben had less patience. "Now we're doing archaeology?" Samuel pointed to the faded cloth. "That's Eli's." Ben's expression changed, though only slightly. Tessa inspected the drainage path, then called the county contact again. The structural inspector still could not reach Redfern Hollow until the following day. Tessa looked at Ben. "Until then, single heavy vehicle on the bridge at a time. Full stop at each end. Lighter local traffic can continue." Ben swore under his breath. Tessa said, "Use better words if you want me to reconsider. You enjoy this?" "No. I enjoy being blamed after things go wrong even less." Ben looked toward Samuel. "Eli never told me that bridge was dangerous." Samuel answered, "Nobody said he did." That surprised Mason more than anything else. Samuel was not weaponizing Eli's name. He was protecting the difference between a clue and a conclusion. Ben finally nodded. "Fine. Single load." The bridge question remained open, but the village had acted on what it actually knew instead of what anyone feared. That afternoon, Mason went to the diner because the truck's heater had stopped producing anything warmer than disappointment, and the diner had soup. Bracken came with him on June's long leash after Samuel muttered that the dog was apparently conducting village business now. Mason chose a booth near the back. Bracken settled beneath the window, watching shoes and listening to the clatter of dishes. A man from the mill took the stool at the counter and recognized Mason. He was perhaps 50, heavy through the arms, with sawdust still caught along one cuff. "You hail?" Mason kept eating. "Depends." The man glanced around as though checking whether enough people were listening. "I went to school with Eli." Mason set down his spoon. "He always came back when something needed doing," the man said. "Bridge, storm cleanup, somebody's roof." Mason waited. The man turned slightly. "Difference is, he came back for other people." The diner changed temperature without getting quieter. Mason stood. The mill worker stood too. For 1 second, every unfinished story in Redfern Hollow seemed to lean toward the space between them. Mason reached into his pocket, put cash beside the bowl, and walked out. Behind him, Bracken rose immediately and followed. Outside, cold air hit Mason's face. He crossed to the pickup, jaw locked so tightly his teeth hurt. A garage sat beside the diner. Someone inside dropped the heavy metal door. The slam tore through the parking lot. For half a second, Mason was somewhere else. A narrow corridor. Dust hanging in artificial light. A voice over the radio. Eli ahead. Mason behind. A rote collapsing between them. His own voice, sharper than he remembered it. "Go!" Then nothing. Mason drove the heel of his hand once against the side of the truck. The sound brought him back. Bracken stepped close. No bark, no pawing. The dog simply pressed his shoulder against Mason's leg and stayed there. Mason stared down at the uneven black saddle across Bracken's back. "Don't start." Bracken breathed through his nose. Mason closed his eyes once. When he opened them, the diner window reflected only a man beside a dog in an autumn parking lot. Not the corridor. Not Eli. He lowered a hand onto Bracken's neck for 2 seconds. Okay. The dog moved first. He did not head home. Bracken took Mason and Samuel, who had met them near the school, toward an old maintenance shed behind the closed eastern wing. The building was low, weathered, and almost hidden by stacked snow fencing. Bracken sat beside the door. Samuel frowned. He used to wait here when Eli came for winter gear. Mason looked at the padlock. Who has a key? Half the village, which means nobody can ever find one. Amos Bell appeared 20 minutes later, carrying 3 keys, and the confidence of a man who expected 2 of them to be wrong. The second worked. Inside were shovels, reflective road signs, old radio batteries, rope, salt buckets, work gloves, folded tarps, and the accumulated practical clutter of a place that survived winter, mostly because people remembered where things were. Bracken stayed outside. That mattered to Mason. The dog had led them to a familiar stop. What humans found there was their responsibility. Samuel opened a metal box on a shelf and began sorting through maintenance tags. Here. The cards were not official forms, just scraps Eli had written to himself. Dorothy. Wood. Church generator. Lester. Delivery backup. Harrow North Side. Mason ran a thumb beneath the last line without touching the ink. Then Samuel pulled out another card. North Cut. Check before first hard weather. Mason looked up. What's North Cut? Nobody answered immediately. Amos removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Old timber road on the north slope. Ben, who had come by after Tessa asked him to inventory winter road gear, stopped beside the doorway. Mason saw the change before Ben spoke. Eli never said Northcutt was dangerous. Amos looked at him. No. Ben's shoulders eased a fraction. Then Amos continued. He said the drainage had changed after the last logging season. The room went still. Ben frowned. Changed how? He didn't know yet. Said he wanted to look after the leaves came down and before the hard weather. Mason looked at the card again. There was no warning, no prediction, no secret message left for somebody to discover. Just a job Eli meant to return to, a small observation that had not yet become an answer. Samuel stood beside Mason, staring at his son's handwriting. He never came back to check it. No one corrected him. Outside the shed, Bracken lay in the autumn light with his head on his paws, waiting at another place where Eli once meant to return. For the next 2 days, nobody went to Northcutt. Tessa Boone wanted the county bridge contact to finish reviewing Harrow's north approach before anyone turned one unfinished question into 3 more. Ben Kersey complained that waiting was becoming Redfern Hollow's newest industry, but even he agreed there was no sense climbing the north slope without a plan. Mason did not argue. A week earlier, he might have treated waiting as proof that nothing here belonged to him. Now he understood the difference between leaving and holding position. So he stayed. The olive canvas bag remained unopened on the Warren porch bench, moving inside only at night, when June worried about damp air, and returning to the porch again each morning because she still could not bring herself to place it anywhere permanent. Mason slept in his truck less often, not because Samuel invited him inside, but because June had quietly told him the old mudroom had a cot, and then informed her husband after the fact. Samuel had said, "It leaks heat." June replied, "So does the truck." That ended the matter. Mason used the cot and nothing else. He kept his duffel zipped, his boots aligned beneath it, and never opened the door to Eli's old bedroom at the end of the hall. Bracken gave him no such distance. Each morning, after breakfast, the German Shepherd waited by the front door. The first time Mason pretended not to notice, Bracken sat for 5 full minutes, then walked to Mason and placed his nose against the long leash hanging from the wall hook. Samuel looked over his newspaper. Subtle animal. Mason took the leash. Takes after his owner." Samuel's eyes lifted at the word owner, and the room tightened for half a second. Mason nearly corrected himself. Then Samuel said, "Eli was never subtle in his life. It wasn't forgiveness, it was memory without accusation, which was rarer." Mason clipped the leash and took Bracken out. The remaining autumn route wasn't a trail of secrets. That became clear quickly. Bracken led him first to a low house where an elderly veteran named Warren Pike, no relation to anyone else in the hollow, had a porch step that sagged under one corner. Mason learned Eli had fixed the upper boards the previous fall, but never replaced the lower support. Warren himself had already bought the lumber. He just had not found anyone to help lift the frame. Mason and a 20-year-old mill worker named Cole Haskins did the job together that afternoon, after Cole admitted Eli had taught him to use a generator safely when he was 16. The next stop was a roadside sandbox near a bend, where winter shade kept ice long after the rest of the road thawed. It was half empty. No mystery, no buried warning. Eli used to top it off before the first freeze, because he passed it every week anyway. Tessa added it to the fire department's seasonal list. At the church, Amos Bell replaced the weak generator battery and wrote the date directly on the casing in permanent marker. "There," he said. "Next year, maybe we'll know who forgot." Mason looked at the marker. "That assumes people enjoy accountability." Amos slid his glasses down his nose. "They enjoy it tremendously when it belongs to someone else." Bracken's fourth stop was the portable radio locker inside the church hall. The dog did not enter. He sat where Eli had apparently always left him, beside a maple whose roots lifted the edge of the walkway. Amos checked each radio while Mason called out battery dates. 2 were fine. 1 needed a new pack. 1 had a corroded contact that Amos cleaned with a small brush. Tessa came by, looked at the list, then pulled a folded notebook from her coat and began adding names. "I've been carrying an emergency contact sheet in my head for 10 years, she said. "That's a terrible system." "Works until the head goes missing," Mason said. "Exactly." She added Lester Boone under the western side of the hollow, Dorothy Ames under the upper road, and 3 other older residents who lived alone. Mason noticed she did not write Eli's name anywhere. There was nowhere to put it. Eli had not held an official position. That was the problem. You could replace a title. It was harder to replace a habit. By the end of the second morning, something subtle began happening. People stopped waiting for Mason and Bracken to arrive before acting. Cole Haskins went back to Dorothy's with 2 more loads of split wood. Amos put himself in charge of the church generator and radios. Tessa asked Maurin Shaw to keep an updated list of residents who might need medicine or heat checks during bad weather. A woman from the orchard volunteered to monitor the sandboxes on the upper road. Nothing dramatic changed, yet Mason felt the village shifting around a fact it had not known how to name. Eli had never been the man who kept Redfern Hollow alive. No single person did that. He had simply been the one who noticed small things early. A loose stair, a battery nobody had tested, a delivery that might not make it up the mountain, a box of sand that would matter only after the road froze. When he died, those tasks did not disappear. They became invisible until Bracken began walking them again. That realization bothered Mason more than he expected. He had known Eli under fluorescent lights, bad weather, training schedules, bad coffee, and the particular silence that fell before men entered places they did not control. He knew what Eli sounded like when he was tired, and what jokes he told when everybody else needed to stop thinking. He knew how Eli moved when things went wrong. But Redfern Hollow knew a different man, one who returned home and quietly repaired the edges of other people's lives. Mason had believed grief gave him a complete picture because it hurt so much. It did not. Pain was not the same thing as knowledge. Bracken seemed to notice when Mason stopped moving. On the third afternoon, they were coming back from the church by a route that climbed behind the old school. Mason paused near a split in the lane, looking toward the valley below. He had no clear reason. The light had caught the church roof, and for 1 second, he could imagine Eli standing there complaining about battery terminals and Amos's handwriting. Bracken walked another 6 feet, then stopped. When Mason did not follow, the dog turned around and came back. No pulling, no whining. He simply stood beside Mason until Mason started again. It happened twice more that week, once near Dorothy's, once near the Orchard Road. Mason tried taking a shortcut on the third occasion, cutting across a grassy slope instead of following the old lane. Bracken refused to come. The dog stood on the familiar road and watched him. "You're not flexible," Mason said. Bracken remained still. Mason looked at the slope, then at the dog. "Fine." He returned to the road. Samuel saw them from the fence near the Warren house that evening. Mason had stopped at the familiar bend above the property to adjust the leash. Bracken continued 10 yards, noticed Mason was behind, and came back. Samuel was waiting by the gate when they reached him. He never used to do that. Mason unclipped the leash. "Do what?" "Wait at that bend." Samuel looked at Bracken, who had gone to the water bowl. "Eli used to stop there to talk to Mrs. Crowley before she moved. Dog would keep walking, then come back for him." Mason shrugged. "Maybe he just doesn't want to walk alone." Samuel looked at him for several seconds. "Maybe." He did not argue. For Mason, that was worse. The old anger had been easier. Anger gave him a known position. Samuel hated him. Mason accepted it, and the structure held. But the structure had begun to loosen. Samuel had called him when Bracken went missing. He had allowed Mason to walk the dog. He had defended the distinction between a clue and a conclusion at Harrow Bridge. Now he was watching Bracken treat Mason as someone worth waiting for. Mason knew what Samuel might eventually have to face if that continued. He also knew what he himself was trying not to face. Bracken was not replacing Eli. A dog did not divide loyalty that neatly. The shepherd still slept outside Eli's old room some nights. He still lifted his head whenever Samuel said Eli's name. He still walked routes built by another man's footsteps. But he had begun adjusting those routes around Mason. That felt like forgiveness Mason had not earned. The evening before the Northcutt inspection, June made stew and put 4 bowls on the table before realizing what she had done. 1 was for Samuel, 1 for herself, 1 for Mason. The 4th sat at Eli's old place. June stared at it. Nobody spoke. Then she picked it up and carried it back to the counter. Samuel watched his wife do it. Mason looked down at Bracken beneath the table. The dog rested his chin on his paws. Samuel said, "Did he ever get scared?" Mason looked up. June stopped at the sink. Samuel's eyes stayed on the table. "Eli, did he ever get scared on those jobs?" The question was so unlike the accusations Mason had prepared. For that he answered before caution arrived. "Yes." Samuel looked at him. Mason said, "Of course he did. He never talked like it. He wouldn't." A small, bitter smile touched Samuel's mouth. "No." Mason rubbed his thumb against the side of his spoon. "Being brave doesn't mean you don't get scared." Samuel's face changed. Not softened. Opened. Just enough. "He call your name?" Mason knew which moment Samuel meant. "Yes." June sat down slowly. Samuel asked, "At the end?" Mason's hand stopped moving. He could hear the kitchen clock, the stove fan, Bracken breathing under the table. There were details Mason could not discuss, locations, procedures, operational sequence. But the sentence Samuel wanted was not classified in any meaningful way. Mason could tell him enough. He could say that Eli had been close to leaving, that Mason had told him to go, that Eli made a choice. He could defend himself. That was the part he could not do. "Yeah," Mason said. Samuel waited. What did he say? Mason looked at Bracken. The dog lifted his head. For a moment, Mason saw the last passage again. Not fully, just pieces that still came without permission. Harsh light. Dust. Eli's voice through a radio. The sharp knowledge that time was closing. Mason had spent 8 months refusing to tell Samuel the one thing that might change how the man looked at him, because changing Samuel's mind felt too much like asking the dead for permission to feel better. He almost answered, then stopped. Samuel leaned forward. "What did my son say?" Mason set down the spoon. "I can't." Samuel's chair scraped backward. "Can't or won't?" June said. "Samuel." "No." He looked at Mason. "He comes here after 8 months, walks my son's dog, fixes things my son used to fix, stands at my table and tells me Eli was afraid like he knew him better than I did." Mason absorbed each word. Samuel continued, voice rising now. "And then you decide what part of my son I'm allowed to hear?" Mason said nothing. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Don't decide for me what I can live with?" That hit differently. Mason had spent years making decisions under pressure. Who moved? Who stayed? What risk could be carried? What information mattered? Now Samuel was accusing him of doing the same thing with grief, and he was right. But Mason still could not speak. Samuel left the table. The back door closed hard enough to shake the glass in the cabinet. Bracken rose, took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped and looked at Mason. He did not follow Samuel. He did not come closer to Mason either. He simply stood between them. June cleared the bowls in silence. The next morning, nobody mentioned the argument. Tessa arrived at 7 with Amos and a topographic printout folded under one arm. Ben pulled in 10 minutes later, face already set for disagreement. Samuel came out last. Mason expected him to stay home. He did not. Bracken wore a charcoal walking harness instead of his usual leash attachment because the North Cut trail was steeper and more overgrown. Tessa looked at this group. "We're observing, not fixing. Nobody starts clearing drainage until we know where the water's actually going." Ben nodded. "Finally, something we agree on. You say that every time I tell you not to touch anything." They climbed through red maples and oak, following an old timber road now narrowed by brush. The route rose above Redfern Hollow far enough that the village disappeared behind the trees. Bracken moved steadily beside Mason. Twice the dog stopped at places where old tire ruts split. Amos chose the correct branch, not Bracken. The dog was there because this was another route Eli had walked, not because anyone expected him to interpret drainage. Near the upper cut, Bracken slowed beside a broad flat stone and sat. Samuel stopped behind him. "Eli used to eat lunch there." Mason looked at the rock. Bracken probably remembers getting half of it. Samuel gave the faintest sound. More than half. For 1 second, they were both allowed to know Eli without fighting over him. Then Tessa called from farther ahead, "Come look at this." The main drainage ditch at North Cut ran along the uphill side of the old road. In a healthy year, runoff should have followed the ditch toward a culvert farther west. Instead, sections were clogged with compressed leaves, soil, branches, bark strips, and wood debris. Water from recent light rain had already found shallower routes across the roadbed. Ben crouched beside one pile. "That didn't come from one season." "No," Tessa said. Amos pointed uphill. "Bank's been sloughing for years." Mason studied the slope. Some debris was natural, some was not. Lengths of cut branches and churned material matched the edges of recent logging activity higher on the ridge. Ben saw where Mason was looking. "Don't start," Mason said. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." "No, I was thinking." "That's worse." Tessa ignored both of them and walked the ditch. The concern became clearer as they followed it. If heavier rain came, water would meet several blocked sections, cross the old road, and take the lower fall line toward the north side of Harrow Bridge. The same area already showing erosion. Nobody called it an emergency. Mason certainly did not. But the pieces had begun to connect. Tessa stood with one boot on the edge of the ditch. "This doesn't mean the bridge fails." Ben spread his hands. "Thank you. It means we have drainage we need to address before strong weather." Ben's expression tightened again. "Also fair." Amos poked one compacted mass with a stick. "Some of this is old, some isn't." Ben looked uphill. "Our crews used the upper spur last season." "Debris control?" Tessa asked. "Should have been cleared." "Was it?" Ben took a long breath. Not all of it. No villain. No confession. Just responsibility arriving where convenience had been. Samuel stood apart from the group, looking down the slope toward where the village lay hidden. Mason wondered if he was thinking about Eli's note. North cut. Check before first hard weather. Eli had not discovered a disaster. He had noticed the beginning of a problem and meant to return when autumn exposed more of the ground. He never got that chance. Tessa folded her arms. "We need the weather update before we decide how much work can be done safely and whether Harrow restrictions need to change." Ben looked at the pale sky through the branches. "Forecast says, light rain tomorrow." A voice came from behind them. "Not anymore." Everyone turned. Maren Shaw was climbing the last stretch of the old road in a deep teal quilted vest, breathing harder than she wanted anybody to notice, and holding her phone like evidence in a trial. Ben stared. "What are you doing up here?" "Regretting every life choice that led to walking uphill before lunch." She handed the phone to Tessa. Satellite update came through the post office system. "County warning changed 20 minutes ago." Tessa read silently. Mason watched her face become more serious. Samuel stepped closer. "What changed?" Tessa turned the screen toward Ben. The forecast no longer showed a mild autumn rain. A stronger cold system was moving faster than expected, with heavier rainfall, followed by a sharp drop in temperature. Ben looked from the screen to the clogged drainage ditch. For the first time since Mason had met him, he had no immediate argument. Bracken stood on the old timber road beside the flat stone where Eli used to eat lunch, ears turned toward the rising wind. The little things Eli had once watched were no longer little enough to ignore. 36 hours sounded generous until Tessa Boone wrote it on the whiteboard at the volunteer fire station and began dividing it into pieces. Heavy rain by the following evening. Strong wind after dark. A sharp temperature drop behind the front. Harrow Bridge still open under temporary restrictions. North cut carrying more debris than anyone liked. One generator battery already replaced. 3 radios checked. 1 still waiting on a new pack. Redfern Hollow was not facing a hurricane, a wildfire, or anything dramatic enough to make national news. It was facing the kind of weather small mountain communities respected, because ordinary problems became expensive when several arrived at once. Tessa stood beneath the fluorescent lights, with her radio clipped to her shoulder and a county forecast printed in one hand. Folding chairs filled most of the bay between the fire engine and a wall of coiled hose. Mill workers sat beside orchard families. Samuel Warren took a chair near the back with June beside him. Amos Bell leaned against a cabinet because he claimed chairs made his knees too ambitious. Mar and Shaw had brought a thermos and 3 boxes of grocery store cookies she denied buying for anyone in particular. Mason stood near the side wall. Bracken lay at Samuel's feet, head up, watching the room. Tessa tapped the board. This is not an evacuation meeting. Nobody is panicking. We are deciding what we do before weather removes some choices for us. Ben Kersey sat in the front row, with his arms crossed over a dark thermal shirt. My last 2 loads can be across Harrow by late afternoon tomorrow. Loaded? Tessa asked. Lightened. How light? Ben named a weight. Tessa looked toward the notes from the county bridge contact, who had not yet made it to Redfern Hollow. Still heavier than I like with the north approach washed. Ben's jaw tightened. If I hold them here, those logs sit until the road firms up again. Could be days. I know. Some of the people in this room get paid when trucks move. I know that too. Mason stayed silent until Tessa looked at him. What did you see at North Cut? He kept his answer plain. Blocked drainage in several sections. Some runoff already crossing the old roadbed. If the forecast is right, more water probably reaches the north side of Harrow than it did during the lighter rain. Ben said. Probably. Mason nodded. Probably. Not definitely. No. And the bridge is still standing. Yes. Ben spread one hand. Then maybe we stop talking like it's already gone. Mason looked at Tessa rather than Ben. I'd stop the heavy loads now and clear what can be cleared safely at North Cut before the rain gets here. A mill worker in the second row stood so fast, his chair legs scraped the concrete. Mason recognized him from the diner, though not the man who had confronted him there. This one was younger, broad through the shoulders, with work gloves shoved into a back pocket. We're not losing a day because you walked in here and decided the whole hollow is unsafe, Tessa said. Sit down, Roy. He stayed standing. No disrespect to you, Tessa. His eyes moved to Mason. But I'm not letting the man who got Eli killed come back 8 months later and decide my family misses a paycheck. The room went quiet in the particular way a small town went quiet when everyone already knew the sentence, but had not expected somebody to say it aloud. June looked down at her hands. Samuel did not move. Mason felt the old answer rise inside him. Take it. Say nothing. Let the punishment land where it always landed. That had been easier when only he paid for it. But this room was discussing a bridge, a slope, a storm, and families who would have to live with whatever happened after everyone went home. I'm not deciding anything, Mason said. Roy laughed once without humor. Sounds like you are. Mason pointed toward Tessa. She decides the restrictions. Then he looked at Roy. I'm telling her what I saw. Roy folded his arms. And we're supposed to trust you? Mason's gaze moved briefly toward Samuel, then back. The bridge doesn't care what you think of me. Nobody spoke. It doesn't care what I think of myself either, Mason added. If the water changes the ground under it, that happens whether I'm right about anything else or not. Tessa stepped forward before the room could turn the sentence into another argument. That's enough. Nobody here is voting on Mason Hale. We're talking about access, weather, and what options we have if Harrow closes. Roy sat. Not happily. But he sat. Mason did not feel victorious. He felt tired. Still, something had changed. On the day he arrived, he had accepted every insult because he believed he deserved it. Tonight, he had let the insult exist and continued speaking anyway. Not for himself, for the problem in front of him. Tessa drew a line down the whiteboard. East side, west side. If Harrow becomes unusable, east keeps the fire station, Marin's store, most reserve fuel, and the easier road to town. West keeps the war in place, Leicester, 11 other households, and the Orchard Spur. Vehicle detour is long even in good weather. Amos said. Longer now. County crew reported trees down on the ridge loop. Ben rubbed his beard. So we keep Harrow open as long as we safely can. Maybe, Tessa said. But I want a second way to move essentials before we need one. Bracken lifted his head. At first, Mason thought the dog was reacting to the raised voices. Then Bracken stood, turned toward the side door of the fire station, and gave a small pull against the leash looped around Samuel's chair. Samuel looked down. What? Bracken pulled again. June said, He needs out. Samuel unclipped the loop, but kept hold of the leash. Come on. Mason followed only because Tessa had paused the meeting, and several people needed an excuse to breathe. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to move dry leaves across the station yard in long, scraping lines. Bracken did not head toward the grass beside the building. He moved past the parking lot and toward an old, overgrown lane that disappeared between two lines of maple. Samuel shortened the leash. This isn't his usual route. Amos came out behind them and stopped. Hold on! He walked to a leaning wooden post, half hidden in sumac. A dull silver reflector was nailed near the top. Amos wiped dirt from it with his sleeve. Well, I'll be. Tessa joined them. What? Old wagon route marker. Ben looked skeptical. That thing hasn't been a road since before I could drive. For trucks, no. Amos pointed toward the trees. Before Harrow was built, people used that grade to cross the ridge and come down behind the Western Orchard Road. My father walked it in bad winters. Mason looked at Bracken. The dog was not pawing at the marker or behaving as if he had discovered something. He simply stood facing the lane, body relaxed, waiting. Samuel said, Eli used to hike up there. With Bracken? Mason asked. Samuel nodded slowly. Sometimes. That was enough. Bracken had not found a solution. He had remembered a road. Tessa turned immediately practical. Can people still walk it? Amos shrugged. Parts of it. Haven't been the whole way in years. Then we check the first section now. Daylight left. Ground still dry. Ben glanced back at the station. Meeting? Meeting just found an agenda. That got the first real laugh of the evening. The wagon road had narrowed into something between a trail and an old scar through the woods. Grass covered the center. Leaves hid shallow ruts where iron-rimmed wheels had once passed. Tessa took Amos and Mason only far enough to determine whether the route remained usable near the village end. Bracken went on leash beside Mason. Samuel came as well, against June's suggestion that his knee had already done enough for one day. My knee doesn't get a vote, he said. June answered, It complains more than you do. Impossible. Mason heard it and almost smiled. Half a mile up, the old road crossed a gentle slope and split near a stand of hickory. Bracken angled left without hesitation. Amos checked an old blaze on a tree and nodded. That's it. Tessa looked at the grade. Not for vehicles. Never again, Amos said. But a healthy person with a pack could do it. Mason scanned the slope rather than the distance. How far to the western side? 3, maybe 4 miles depending where you come down. Too long for routine use. Yes. Tessa nodded. But not too long for medication, radio batteries, food, or messages if Harrow closes. The plan did not solve the bridge. It gave them another choice. That changed the meeting. Back at the station, Tessa wrote wagon route beneath the two sides of the hollow and added a list of what could be moved on foot. Medication, handheld radios, batteries, small fuel canisters, only if handled properly. Food, blankets. Nothing heavy enough to turn a backup route into a bad idea. Ben still wanted the final timber. Loads moved before the weather. Tessa compromised only as far as she believed the situation allowed. One final light load before late afternoon. Then no heavy commercial traffic until after the front. Ben stared at the board for a long moment. That load matters. I know. You keep saying that. Because I do. He exhaled. All right. 1. The room loosened, not because everyone agreed, but because a decision existed. The next morning, Mason and Amos returned to mark the first mile of the wagon route with temporary reflective tape. Tessa wanted enough of it identified that volunteers would not waste time finding the entrance after dark. The air had changed overnight, warmer than expected, but restless. Clouds moved fast above the ridgeline. Bracken walked ahead on a long leash, stopping at familiar bends and waiting whenever Mason paused to tie a marker. Samuel came with extra tape in his jacket pocket. He said it was because Amos would lose half of it. Amos objected from 20 yards ahead. I heard that. Samuel called back, then your hearing works better than your memory. For a few minutes, they sounded like ordinary older men on an ordinary trail. A dead limb came down somewhere higher on the slope. The crack was sharp and sudden. Mason stopped. The forest disappeared. Not completely. Enough. A corridor surfaced over it, narrow and bright with dust. Eli was ahead, Mason behind. A blocked passage between. Voices on the radio, clipped and urgent. The team moving toward an exit they could still reach. Mason heard his own voice. Go! Eli turned. Mason knew what came next. The memory would not give it to him cleanly. His chest tightened. He took one breath and lost the rhythm of the second. Bracken had continued several steps before noticing. The dog stopped, turned, came back. He pressed his shoulder against Mason's left leg. No command, no trick, just contact. Mason lowered one hand to the dog's ruff and stared at a wet red leaf stuck to his boot until it became only a leaf. Samuel was watching from behind, not impatiently, not accusing. Watching. Mason straightened. I'm fine. Samuel looked at Bracken. Didn't look fine. Usually doesn't. That answer escaped before Mason could guard it. Samuel's face changed. For the first time, he was not looking at Mason as the man who had walked away from Eli. He was looking at someone who had never completely walked away from that day at all. No one discussed it on the trail. They finished marking the first section and returned before the first drops began. That evening, the rain stayed light. Samuel found Mason under the porch roof, checking the weather radio Tessa had left with them. Bracken lay between the door and Mason's boots. Samuel stood at the railing. Did Eli go back because of you? There was no anger in the question. That made it harder. Mason did not answer at first. The rain ticked softly against the metal gutter. Finally, he said, Yes. Samuel swallowed. You asked him to? No. What did you tell him? Mason looked toward the dark yard. Go. Samuel's hands closed around the porch rail. So why didn't he? Mason knew the answer. He knew Eli's voice. He knew the sentence after the one his memory kept returning to. He could say it, but saying it would turn Eli's choice into evidence for Mason's defense, and some part of him still recoiled from that. Mr. Warren, Samuel turned toward him. Don't. Mason stopped. Samuel waited. Mason could not finish. After a prolonged moment, Samuel stepped off the porch and walked into the house. He did not slam the door this time. That felt worse. The rain strengthened after midnight. Tessa's volunteers checked the accessible drainage points in pairs. Nobody climbed North Cut in darkness. Nobody went beneath Harrow Bridge. They monitored from safe positions, cleared only minor roadside grates they could reach without risk, and stayed in radio contact. Mason worked the western side with Samuel and a younger orchard hand. Water moved through ditches and shining brown ribbons, carrying leaves and small branches downhill. Harrow remained open only to local cars for several hours. Then Tessa stopped all non-essential traffic when the north approach began shedding muddy runoff across one lane. By 3 in the morning, the rain had become steady enough that conversation required raised voices under the Warren porch. By 4, the temperature began dropping. At 4:37, Tessa's voice came through the handheld radio. "North Harrow team to west side. Approach shoulder is moving. Repeat, north shoulder is moving. No vehicles onto the bridge." Mason was already on his feet. Samuel reached for his jacket. Mason said, "We wait for Tessa." Samuel glared at him. "I know my own bridge. And she knows who's where." For 1 second, Mason expected another fight. Samuel stopped, then nodded. That was small. It mattered. At dawn, the rain eased enough for Tessa to inspect the north approach from safe ground. Mason stood 50 yards back with Samuel and Bracken. A section of the dirt shoulder above the abutment had slumped away, leaving raw brown earth and exposed roots, where the day before there had been leaf-covered ground. Harrow Bridge itself still stood straight. The rails were intact. No dramatic collapse had occurred. But the road leading onto it was no longer something Tessa would allow vehicles to trust. She keyed her radio. "Harrow closed to all vehicle traffic until county inspection." Ben's answer came from the east side after a burst of static. "Copy." No argument. Not this time. The decision split Redfern Hollow immediately. Marin's store and the fire station sat east of the creek. The Warren house, Lester Boone, several orchard families, and more than a dozen other homes sat west. The long vehicle detour over the ridge was already partially blocked by storm-fallen branches. Nobody was trapped in the dramatic sense, but the easy connection holding the hollow together was gone. Tessa began issuing assignments. West side check Lester first, east side inventory fuel and food. Nobody uses the wagon road until daylight improves, and I clear a walking team. Then the radio hissed. Amos's voice came through. "Tessa, ridge repeater just dropped." She tried another channel. Nothing. The handheld still worked locally, but the repeater that extended their range across the ridge was gone. Amos looked up toward the old wagon road disappearing through wet trees. "There used to be a shelter at the top." Tessa turned. "Emergency radio? If the box is still there. Battery?" Amos gave a tired shrug. "That's the question." Mason looked at him. "Who checked it last?" Amos's eyes shifted toward Bracken. The German shepherd stood beside Mason, rain beating on the black saddle of his coat, ears turned toward the ridge. Amos said quietly, "Eli." The bridge was closed. The hollow was divided. And somewhere above them, on a road, Bracken still remembered. There might be one more piece of preparation Eli had left unfinished. The ridge repeater had been dead for 11 minutes when Tessa Boone stopped trying to fix the problem from the fire station. She stood over a folding table covered with maps, handwritten household lists, 2 radios, a flashlight, and 3 paper cups nobody remembered filling. Harrow Bridge was closed. The vehicle detour over the ridge remained blocked in 2 places. The western side of Redfern Hollow could still reach the eastern side by handheld radio in spots, but the signal broke whenever the terrain got between them. Outside, the rain had thinned to a cold mist, and the temperature was dropping faster than forecast. "We need the backup set on the ridge," Tessa said. Amos Bell nodded from beside the radio cabinet. "If it still works." "You said the shelter is on the wagon road." "Near it, half a mile above the old fork." Tessa looked at Mason. "You walked the first section yesterday. First mile? Comfortable going farther?" Mason studied this paper map instead of answering quickly. "With Amos. Daylight. Small team." "Good." Ben Kersey, standing near the bay door with mud on his boots, said, "I've got 2 men who know the lower timber roads." Tessa shook her head. "Not sending 6 people up a wet trail to retrieve a radio." She chose Cole Haskins, the young mill worker who had helped repair the porch step. and Nate Bell, a 31-year-old orchard mechanic who had grown up hiking the ridge with Amos. 4 men. 1 dog. No one alone. "You check the route as you go," Tessa said. "If Amos says turn around, you turn around. If Mason says the footing is bad, you turn around. If the dog does something interesting, you still ask Amos before you turn it into religion." Amos looked offended. "That seems targeted." "It is." Bracken wore the charcoal harness June had used on rough trails with Eli. Mason clipped the leash to the back ring and crouched long enough to check the fit. The German Shepherd stood calmly, tail low, rain beating along the uneven black saddle over his back. Samuel waited several feet away beneath the station awning. He had argued about coming. Tessa had refused. His left knee was already stiff, and the first trip needed to move quickly. Samuel had not liked the answer, which did not make it wrong. "Bring him back," June said, and Mason knew she meant Bracken first. Then she looked at Mason. "Both of you?" Mason nodded. Samuel said nothing until Mason stepped onto the old wagon road. Then, quietly enough that the others had already moved ahead, he said, "Don't make me regret letting that dog go with you." Mason looked at Bracken. "I think he's the one deciding whether I come back." Samuel's mouth almost moved. That sounds like him. The old road climbed under wet maple and hickory, broad enough in places to show what it had once been, and narrow enough elsewhere that the forest had nearly reclaimed it. Amos set the pace. He knew the ridge from years before, but even he stopped often to confirm where the old grade continued beneath the leaves and runoff. Bracken did not pull like a dog tracking scent. He walked with steady familiarity. At the first fork, where a younger logging spur cut uphill, he leaned toward the left branch and paused. Amos studied a mossed-over stone retaining edge. "Left is right." Cole glanced at Mason. "That sentence should be illegal." Amos started walking. "At my age, grammar is optional." The second fork was harder. A fallen maple hid the old center line, and both branches looked equally plausible. Bracken stood facing the lower root. Amos went 10 yards up the higher one, checked an old blaze, then returned. "Dog wins," Mason said. "Don't tell him." Too late. Look at his face. Bracken looked exactly the same. Halfway up, the wagon road bent around a steep shoulder, where the woods opened enough to show the gray shape of Redfern Hollow below. Harrow Bridge was visible through the bare branches, small and still over the creek. From here, it looked harmless. The east and west sides of the village seemed close enough to shout across. Mason had learned that distance was often less about miles than what stood between them. Ahead, Cole pointed toward a faint track dropping directly down the slope. That would save 10 minutes. Mason looked at the wet leaves, then at the contour of the ground. Bracken walked to the entrance of the shortcut and stopped. He sniffed once, then stepped back and turned toward the longer wagon road. Nate said, "He doesn't like it." Mason did not answer the dog as if it understood risk. "Amos." The older man stared down the slope. There used to be wooden steps there, long gone. He tapped the ground with one boot. "Eli never used that cut after they rotted. Went around every time." Mason looked at Bracken. The dog was already waiting on the safer bend. "Then we go around." Cole glanced at the shortcut again. Could still be fine. Mason said, "Maybe. We have a route we know and one we don't. No prize for choosing the shorter unknown." Cole nodded and followed. The dog had not known the steps were rotten. He remembered the path Eli had chosen. That memory had changed 4 human decisions in less than a mile. The shelter appeared after another 40 minutes, half hidden beneath hemlocks near the ridge. It was little more than a 3-sided timber structure with a metal roof, a bench, and a locked weather cabinet mounted to the back wall. Amos produced a ring of keys. "If the right key is not on here, I plan to blame Tessa, Nate said. Why? She's not here. The third key worked. Inside sat a waterproof equipment box, 2 lanterns, a compact first aid kit, a coil of reflective cord, folded paper maps, and a portable radio base unit sealed in a heavy plastic case. Amos checked the battery pack. Old. Mason looked at the date. Not dead necessarily. Nate opened the backup pouch and found 2 sealed replacement batteries. Cole let out a breath. That feels lucky. Amos pointed at a laminated inspection sheet taped inside the cabinet. Not luck. Somebody maintained it. The entries were ordinary. Dates, battery tests, antenna checks, names. Amos, Tessa, another volunteer. Then the final line from the previous autumn. E. Warren, battery replaced, antenna dry, nothing else. No warning, no note to his parents, no message waiting from Mason. Just Eli's name beside a date and a task completed. Bracken walked to the bench under the shelter roof, circled once, and lay beside its left leg. Amos watched him. That's where Eli made him wait while he worked. Mason kept his eyes on the inspection sheet. He had spent days following clues that were not clues at all, places Eli stopped, chores Eli remembered, things the village had quietly let become part of one man's routine. This was another one. The signature hurt precisely because it was so ordinary. Eli had come here expecting there would be another autumn. Mason handed the sheet back. Let's make sure his replacement still works. They fitted the fresh battery, connected the portable antenna, and called Tessa. Static answered first, then a faint voice. Ridge team, say again. Amos grinned. Tessa, if you can hear me, I want it documented that I remain useful. Her reply came stronger. I'll enter it as an unverified claim. Cole laughed loudly enough to startle Bracken. Within 15 minutes, the radio base was relaying clean communication between both sides of the hollow. Tessa immediately began using it to coordinate supply lists. Lester Boone's medication would run out in 3 days, not 1, which lowered urgency, but did not remove it. 2 Western households needed extra fuel for portable heaters. Dorothy Ames was fine. June had enough food for several neighbors if needed. Marin had already packed dry goods into loads a person could carry. The problem changed the moment communication returned. Before, the hollow had 2 separated halves, guessing what the other needed. Now, it had one plan. The first supply group came over the wagon road before noon. Young people carried food, medicine, batteries, and blankets in hiking packs. Older residents prepared soup and hot drinks at both ends. Tessa assigned check-in times, instead of allowing volunteers to wander back and forth whenever they felt useful. Amos stayed at the ridge shelter to manage the relay. Mason made a second trip with Nate and Cole, then a third with a smaller load of radio equipment. Bracken did not go every time. After the first return, June checked his paws, gave him water, and refused to let Mason take him immediately back uphill. He remembers the road, she said, but he's still 6 years old, not a postal service. Mason sat on the porch step beside the dog. You heard her. Bracken drank. Union rules. By afternoon, the rain had nearly stopped. Ben Kersey and several mill workers joined Tessa's approved crew at the lower Northcutt drainage, where the ground was stable enough for hand clearing. Nobody touched the unstable bank above Harrow. They removed loose slash and debris from accessible sections, so remaining runoff had a clearer path. Mason arrived carrying reflective cord and found Ben knee-deep in wet leaves, dragging a branch pile aside with Roy and 2 others. Ben saw him. Before you say it, yes. Some of this is ours. Mason set down the cord. Wasn't going to say anything. That's becoming annoying. Tessa walked over. Ben pointed uphill. Last season we should have cleaned that spur better. We didn't. Tessa nodded. And this ditch was already neglected before your crew touched it. Ben looked surprised by the lack of accusation. So whose fault is it? Everybody who enjoys blaming one person can form a committee after winter, Mason said. Marin can charge admission. Ben looked at him. For the first time, the bigger man laughed. They worked for nearly an hour without discussing Harrow, Eli, or who had been right. At one point, Mason needed a coil of rope from the tool pile. He turned, and Ben was already holding it out. No handshake, no apology, just equipment transferred from one man to another because a job needed doing. It was enough. By evening, the temporary foot route was functioning reliably. Tessa had 2 scheduled supply runs, a radio check every 30 minutes, and a county crew due the next morning to begin stabilizing the bridge approach. Redfern Hollow had not been rescued by a Navy SEAL. It had reorganized itself. That mattered to Mason more than he expected. Samuel joined the final westbound walking group after Tessa cleared him for the slower return. His knee had rested most of the day, and he refused a ride on the east side because there was nowhere for a vehicle to go beyond the closure anyway. Mason, Samuel, and Bracken fell behind the others after the first mile. The rain had stopped completely. Water still dripped from branches, and the road underfoot was dark with wet leaves. For several minutes, Samuel said nothing. Then, what did Eli say? Mason did not ask what he meant. There was no audience here, no diner, no villagers, no chance that telling Samuel would repair Mason's reputation before anyone else. Just a father walking behind the dog his son had loved. Mason kept his eyes on the trail. He told me to get the others out. Samuel's breathing changed. Could he have gone with you? Mason did not answer. He did not need to. Samuel stopped walking. Mason stopped too. Bracken went a few steps farther, noticed both men had stopped, and returned to stand between them. Samuel looked through the trees rather than at Mason. Then why did he stay? Mason swallowed. Because I wasn't out. The older man closed his eyes. For 8 months, Mason had imagined Samuel hearing that sentence. In every version, anger followed. Maybe a fist. Maybe a command to leave. Samuel only looked older. You were stuck? Yes. You told him to go? Yes. And he came back? Mason nodded. Samuel's voice roughened. Did you leave him there? There it was. The question underneath every look since Mason entered Redfern Hollow. Mason faced him fully. No. Samuel's eyes lifted. I went back. The woods seemed to hold the space after the words. Mason forced himself to finish. I couldn't reach him in time. Samuel looked away. Bracken stood still, head moving between them. Mason expected Samuel to ask more. He did not. He resumed walking. Mason followed. That was all. No forgiveness, no apology. But the story Samuel had lived inside for 8 months could no longer remain the same shape. 2 days later, the weather had cleared into a cold blue morning. County crews stabilized the damaged shoulder and installed temporary barriers around the worst erosion. Harrow remained closed to heavy timber loads, but limited local traffic was scheduled to resume after inspection. Ben's company arranged a different route for the next commercial loads, inconvenient and expensive, but workable. North Cut had a formal maintenance plan now. Tessa assigned seasonal checks by name, instead of relying on whoever happened to remember. Amos took radio responsibility. Cole and 2 others took road sand and generator support. Marin maintained emergency household lists. No one person inherited Eli's route. That afternoon, Mason packed his duffel. He had done what he came to do, or so he told himself. The bag was delivered. Bracken's autumn route had been understood. Redfern Hollow had made it through the storm. Samuel knew Mason had not abandoned Eli. Staying longer felt dangerous in a way the weather never had. The Warren house had begun making room around him without asking permission. June left a towel near the mudroom cot. Samuel had stopped announcing when Mason could leave. Bracken waited by the door whenever Mason put on his boots. Mason knew how to carry blame. He did not know how to occupy a place someone else had once filled. He told June he would leave in the morning. She looked at his packed duffel. Does Samuel know? He'll figure it out. That's not what I asked. Mason almost smiled. I'll tell him. June nodded, but did not argue. That night, the house settled early. Samuel went to bed after checking the weather radio twice. Mason sat in the mudroom with his jacket folded beside the duffel, listening to the quiet. Then he noticed Bracken was missing. Not outside. Not by Eli's bedroom, not beside Samuel's chair. The German Shepherd lay in the living room beside the olive canvas bag. June stood in the doorway. Bracken. The dog lifted his head. June looked at the bag and immediately looked away. Bracken rose. He walked to her, touched his nose gently to the back of her hand, then returned to the canvas bag and lay beside it again. June's face tightened. No. Bracken stayed there. No whining, no scratching. He did not know about the letter hidden inside. He did not know what any object meant beyond scent, habit, and the people connected to it. But he knew the bag smelled like Eli, and he knew June had spent days walking around it. She tried once more. Come on, Bracken. The dog placed his head on his paws. June's eyes filled. Mason stood near the mudroom door, unsure whether leaving the room would be kinder. June looked at him. Is there something in there you haven't told me about? Mason looked at the bag. Yes. Her face changed. He continued before fear could become the wrong conclusion. There are a lot of things in there I've never seen either. June took one step closer, then another. Bracken lifted his head but did not move. June sat on the edge of the sofa. For the first time since Mason arrived, she reached for the olive canvas. Her fingers rested on the zipper. Mason had planned to be gone by morning. Now even that decision would have to wait for whatever Eli had left behind. June did not open the bag that night. Her hand stayed on the zipper for a long time, while Bracken lay beside the canvas, and Mason stood near the mudroom door, careful not to move closer. Samuel came in from the hallway, saw his wife on the sofa, saw the bag beneath her hand, and stopped. No one suggested she hurry. After several minutes, June released the zipper, wiped both palms against her jeans, and said, "Morning." It was not a question. Samuel nodded. Mason carried the bag from the floor to the low table when she asked, then went back to the mudroom cot. He slept badly, but differently. There was no storm outside now, no radio traffic, no bridge report. Only the knowledge that somewhere in the next room, the thing he had driven nearly 2,000 miles to deliver, was finally close to becoming what it had always been meant to become. Not evidence, not punishment, but Eli's belongings in Eli's home. Morning came clear and cold. Rain had scrubbed the valley clean, and sunlight reached the Warren house through bare gaps in the maple canopy. Water still dropped from the porch roof in slow intervals. Harrow Bridge remained under restrictions, but the emergency was over. County crews had the approach stabilized. Redfern Hollow was no longer measuring itself by radio checks and supply runs. For the first time since Mason arrived, nobody needed him to do anything practical. That was harder. June sat in the living room wearing her burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse. Bracken lay pressed against her right foot. Samuel sat in the armchair opposite the low table, elbows on his knees. Mason stood beside the doorway. June looked at him. "You can sit." "I'm fine." Samuel glanced toward the nearest chair. "That one doesn't bite." Mason stayed where he was. Samuel gave a tired breath. Apparently the dog isn't the stubbornest thing Eli brought home. Mason almost smiled, but June's hand had already moved toward the zipper. The room quieted. The bag opened with a sound so ordinary Mason hated it. June folded the top back. The first thing she removed was an old watch with a dark leather band, scratched across the face but still intact. Samuel recognized it before she spoke. He hated that watch. No, June said. He hated being told to wear it. Samuel looked at Mason. He lose track of time with you too? Constantly. June placed the watch on the table. Next came a faded baseball cap, a dark flannel shirt folded more neatly than Mason would have believed possible, a small unit patch, 3 printed photographs held together with a rubber band, and a pocket knife with a bone-colored handle. Samuel reached for the knife. His thumb ran along one worn edge. I gave him this when he turned 18. Mason had seen Eli use it hundreds of times, cutting cord, opening boxes. Once trying to fix a coffee machine neither man understood. He had never known where it came from. Samuel closed the blade and placed it beside the watch. Nothing in the bag was extraordinary. That was what made it difficult. Eli had survived dangerous places and carried things that belonged to an ordinary life. A knife from his father. A shirt his mother probably washed 100 times. Photographs nobody had framed because nobody expected they would become important. June opened the next photograph. Eli stood beside Bracken at the Warren fence several autumns earlier, one boot on the lower rail, laughing at something outside the frame. Bracken was younger, darker around the muzzle, both ears perfectly alert. The dog raised his head when June said Eli's name. She lowered the photograph. Bracken came closer and sniffed it once. Then he rested his chin against June's knee. No searching. No confusion. Just recognition of familiar scent mixed with paper and hands. June whispered, "You miss him too, don't you?" Bracken closed his eyes. Mason looked toward the window. He had seen people try to make animals into messages because grief wanted the world to answer back. Bracken did not need to be a message. He was a dog who had loved Eli, and that was enough. June reached deeper into the bag. Her fingers stopped. She slowly withdrew a small brown leather case. For the first time that morning, she made a sound that was almost a gasp. Samuel leaned forward. "What?" June opened the flap. Inside lay an old brass compass. The leather was creased and darkened with age. One corner had been repaired with a few rough stitches. June held it with both hands. "I gave him this." Samuel stared. "When?" 16. Her voice thinned. "He went camping up past Alder Ridge with Tommy Grady and 2 other boys. First time he was gone overnight without us." Samuel looked at the compass. "You told me he bought that himself. I told you that because you said I worried too much. You did. I was right. You usually arranged it that way." June laughed once, then covered her mouth. The laugh broke into tears. Bracken rose and put his nose beneath her wrist. She lowered her hand onto his head. Mason had heard people cry in rooms where words mattered. He had never been good at it. Eli used to make fun of him for that. "You can walk through bad weather with a radio in pieces," Eli once told him. "But let somebody cry near you, and suddenly, you're furniture." Mason remembered the line so clearly that for a second, he could hear Eli's voice. June looked toward the bag again. "There's another pocket," Mason said. "I never opened it." "I know." She unzipped the small inside compartment. Her fingers found paper. The envelope was plain. No official marking. No date on the outside. 2 words were written across the front in Eli's handwriting. Mom and Dad. Samuel went still. June stared at the words. Mason took 1 step backward. Samuel noticed. Stay. Mason looked at him. Samuel did not repeat it. June opened the envelope. The paper inside had been folded twice. She began reading silently, then stopped after the first line. Out loud, Samuel asked. June nodded. Her voice trembled. Mom, if Dad is on the roof when you read this, make him come down before you continue. Samuel closed his eyes. June laughed through tears. That sounds like him, she continued. Dad, if Mom is feeding Bracken bacon again, you have my permission to complain, even though we all know the dog listens to her more than he listens to you. Please keep pretending otherwise, for the sake of your dignity. Samuel rubbed one hand over his mustache. Traitor. Bracken looked at him. June read about Redfern Hollow, the orchard road, the church generator, the smell of wood smoke in October. Eli wrote that he never knew which things from home he missed until he was away from them. He told his parents not to turn his bedroom into a museum if anything happened to him. He asked them to keep Bracken active because a bored shepherd was a management problem with teeth. Then June's voice changed. She reached Mason's name. He heard it before he was ready. Mason is the best friend I've ever had. Mason stared at the floorboards. June kept reading. He is also the most stubborn man I know, which is impressive, considering I grew up with Dad. Samuel looked at Mason. Mason did not look back. He is the person I trust most when things go bad. I have trusted him with my life more times than I can count, and he has trusted me with his. June paused. Bracken moved closer to her chair. She continued, If there comes a day when I don't come home, please don't ask Mason why he couldn't save me before you ask what I chose to do. The room changed. Samuel's face emptied. June tried to read the next line. She could not. She handed the letter to Samuel. He took it carefully, as if the paper had weight. Mason moved toward the door. Samuel said, No. Mason stopped. Samuel read, Mason has a bad habit of turning anything that happens to the people beside him into a sentence against himself. His voice roughened. Don't help him do that. Mason closed his eyes. The letter had been written before the final mission, before Eli knew which one of them would be the person left carrying anything. That was what made it worse. Eli had known him well enough to predict the punishment, even without knowing the crime. Samuel read on. If Mason comes to Redfern Hollow alone, he is probably carrying more than whatever is in this bag. A long silence, then the last lines. He is the brother I chose. If I don't come home one day, don't leave him standing on the porch just because I'm not there to open the door. Samuel stopped. His mouth tightened. June looked down at Bracken. Samuel forced himself to finish. Give him a place at the table. No one moved. Mason had imagined anger for 8 months. He had prepared for Samuel to hate him. He had prepared for June to turn away. He had prepared for a village to call him coward, traitor, survivor. He had never prepared for Eli to defend him. Not like this. Not from before the very event Mason had used to condemn himself. I don't deserve that, Mason said. Samuel lowered the letter. Maybe that's the problem. Mason looked at him. Samuel's eyes were red. You keep deciding what you deserve. Mason swallowed. Samuel continued. You decided we should hate you? I didn't tell you to. No. You just made sure we had every reason. Mason had no answer. June held the compass against her chest. Samuel looked at the letter again. You told me you went back. Yes. Tell me the rest. Mason's first instinct was refusal. Then he looked at the envelope. Eli had taken that choice away from him more gently than anyone else could have. Mason sat. Not in Eli's chair. in the plain wooden chair nearest the door. He rested his forearms against his knees. "There are details I can't give you." Samuel nodded. "I don't need details." Mason stared at Bracken. "The team was pulling out. I got caught behind when part of the passage closed." June's hand tightened around the compass. "Eli was ahead, close enough that he could have kept going." Samuel asked, "And you told him to?" "Yes." "What did you say?" "Go." The word sounded different here than it had in Mason's head for 8 months. Not command. Plea. Mason continued. He went farther toward the exit. Samuel's eyes stayed on him. "Then he came back," June whispered. "For you." Mason nodded. "He came back far enough to help open another route, stayed long enough for me and the others to get through." Samuel's voice was low. "Could he have left?" Mason looked at him. "Yes." June covered her mouth. Samuel turned away for several seconds. Mason forced himself to continue. "I went back after the others were moving." "You went back for Eli?" "Yes." Samuel looked at him again. Mason's voice dropped. "I didn't get to him in time." The room held the sentence. No one tried to improve it. Samuel asked, "What did he say at the end?" Mason stared at the floor. He had protected that sentence like punishment. Maybe because it was the last piece of Eli that belonged only to him. Maybe because saying it aloud would prove something Mason had spent months refusing to believe. He said, "Get them home." June began crying again. Samuel did not. Not yet. Mason said, "So I did." His voice tightened. "I got them out. Got everybody I could back." He rubbed one hand over the edge of his black watch. "And then I spent 8 months thinking he should have gone home instead of me." Samuel breathed through his nose. "You thought it should have been you." "Yes." The answer came easily because there was no reason left to hide it. Samuel looked at Eli's letter. "You let us punish you." Mason said nothing. "Because you thought somebody should." Mason's silence confirmed it. Samuel's hand closed around the letter, then relaxed before he damaged the page. "My son made a choice." "Yes." "You hated yourself for his choice." Mason looked away. Samuel's voice broke slightly. "And you let me hate you for it too," Mason answered quietly. "I figured you had the right." Samuel looked at him for a long time. "No." The word was not forgiveness. It was refusal. Samuel raised the letter. "That wasn't your decision either." Mason felt something inside him resist. The old structure was simple. Eli died. Mason lived. Therefore, Mason owed something impossible. But the letter complicated the math. Eli had known exactly who Mason was. He had chosen anyway. Samuel stood. For 1 second, Mason thought the older man would leave. Instead, Samuel placed the letter in June's hands and walked outside. By afternoon, half of Redfern Hollow knew something had changed. Though not yet. Not yet what? Samuel went to Marin Shaw's store alone. Mason did not follow. Later, Marin told him Samuel had stood beside the coffee counter, waited for the room to notice him, and said only, "We were wrong about Mason Hale." Ben Kersey had been there. He asked the obvious question. "Why didn't he tell anybody?" Samuel answered, "Because he believed us." That was all. No speech, no public confession, no demand that everyone apologize. The village changed in smaller ways. A man who had avoided Mason at the fuel pump offered his hand. Cole Haskins stopped calling him sir, as if the word were a wall. Ben nodded to Mason from across the road, once, without argument attached. The man from the diner found Mason outside Marin's store the following morning and placed a paper cup beside him. "I said something I shouldn't have." Mason looked at the coffee. "Probably." The man frowned. "That it?" "I'm still learning how to receive apologies." The man almost smiled. Coffee help? Depends how bad it is. Marin made it. From inside the store, Marin shouted, I can hear you. For the first time since Mason entered Redfern Hollow, laughter around him did not feel like something he had to leave. He still packed his truck. That surprised June less than Samuel. Mason had never planned to stay. Knowing the truth did not magically give him a new life. He did not have a job in Redfern Hollow. He did not know what he would do next. More importantly, he still did not know whether sitting inside the Warren family's grief would eventually become another way of taking something that belonged to Eli. The olive canvas bag was empty now. Mason placed it behind their passenger seat. Bracken stood near the gate. The running line around the maple had been removed. Mason and Samuel had repaired the lower fence latch after the storm, and Bracken now moved freely between the porch, yard, and dog door. Mason opened the driver's door. Bracken walked toward him. Mason waited. For a moment he wondered whether the dog would try to climb into the truck. Bracken stopped several feet away, looked at Mason, then looked back. June stood in the doorway. Samuel was behind her. Bracken turned around and walked back to the porch. He sat between them. Mason understood before anyone spoke. Bracken was not choosing Eli over Mason. He was not choosing the Warrens over Mason. He was simply staying where Eli had left him. Home. Mason rested one hand on the open truck door. Mason. Samuel's voice came from the porch. Mason turned. Samuel stepped down one stair. He did not say stay forever. He did not call Mason son. He did not make promises. Grief could not keep. June made too much supper. June looked at him. I did not. Samuel ignored her. Mason waited. Samuel continued. Eli said we were supposed to give you a place. A pause. Sit down first. Mason looked at the truck, then at Bracken, then at the house he had spent 8 months avoiding. He closed the driver's door. That evening, nobody sat in Eli's chair. They left it empty. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. It was simply still his. Samuel sat at one side of the table, June across from him. Mason took another chair. Bracken settled underneath, stretched between Samuel's boots and Mason's. The brass tag on his collar clicked softly against the floor when he shifted. The compass sat on the shelf near the kitchen door. June had not polished it. Samuel had not repaired the leather case. They left the worn edges alone. Outside, late autumn leaves covered the place beneath the maple, where Bracken's running line had once circled the trunk. Samuel would still wake some mornings angry that Eli was gone. June would still touch the flannel shirt and cry. Mason would still hear a sudden sound someday and find part of himself standing in that corridor again. None of them had been fixed. That was not what had happened. Something smaller had changed. Mason had stopped using pain as proof that he belonged outside every door. He looked beneath the table. Bracken was asleep. Mason thought about Eli's last words. Get them home. For 8 months, he had believed the sentence ended with the people he carried out of that final mission. Now he understood it had kept moving without him. Through an autumn road Bracken refused to forget. Through Dorothy's woodpile. Through an old generator. Through Harrow Bridge and North Cut. Through a ridge shelter where Eli had once signed an ordinary inspection sheet. Through a German shepherd who had spent the season retracing the places his owner used to stop. And finally back to this table. Mason did not know how long he would stay in Redfern Hollow. For the first time, he did not need to decide tonight. June passed him the potatoes. Samuel complained that there was too much salt in the stew. June told him he had eaten 2 bowls. Bracken opened one eye. Mason looked at the empty chair. It still hurt. It probably always would. But pain was no longer the same thing as a sentence. He took the bowl June offered him and stayed. Sometimes healing does not mean forgetting the person we lost. It means learning to carry their memory without turning love into a punishment. Mason could not change what happened to Eli, but he could finally accept that surviving wasn't a betrayal. And sometimes, in our own lives, grace begins the same way. Not with a miracle that erases the past, but with a small, open door, an empty chair still honored, and someone quietly asking us to stay. May you find peace with the things you cannot change, and may you never mistake grief for a sentence you must serve alone. If this story meant something to you, please share your thoughts with us, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of loyalty, hope, and second chances. And if you have any feelings, reflections, or suggestions about this story, would you share them in the comments below so we can listen, learn, and keep making these stories better?